Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert, and today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of Plato's Gorgias. In earlier episodes, we saw that Socrates is questioning the rhetorician Gorgias about the power of rhetoric. Gorgias says the power of rhetoric is persuasion, and to persuade people, you don't need to know anything about your subject matter. Socrates questions the justice of persuading people of things that may be false. And after some dithering, Gorgias is not really able to say the relationship of justice and rhetoric. And his student Paulus steps in to say there's a negative relationship, that rhetoric is actually a form of injustice, but that's okay because it's good to be unjust. It's advantageous to be unjust. So we get a sort of proto-Machiavellian doctrine that is lurking behind the ancient art of rhetoric, and the students are aware of this. So this becomes really the subject of the dialogue. Is justice actually good, or is injustice better? Now, Paulus thinks that injustice is better because it helps you to acquire what you desire and to be powerful. So Socrates makes a couple points. First, true power is not getting what you happen to desire. True power is getting what is actually good for you. The obvious example, if you acquire, a bullet in the head, for example, what's the point, right? It's not power because it hurts you. So this sends us back to the weakness of rhetoric, right? If rhetoric is persuading people without knowing the truth, you don't know if something is actually good or not. Both for the audience, but also for you, the speaker, you're not thinking about what's actually good for yourself if you don't think critically about what's good. Second point that Socrates makes with Paulus is that if beauty is a good thing, which Paulus believes it is, and if injustice is ugly, that is, lying and murdering and things like that are ugly, and he admits that they're ugly, then you're making yourself ugly, and you'll come to despise yourself if you commit injustice, and therefore you can't be happy. So even though you acquire things, they're not going to be good for you because you are hurting yourself in the process. You're making yourself hate yourself in the process. Okay, so Callicles steps in, and Callicles is promising that he is not going to back down like Gorgias and Paulus did. He's not going to be ashamed to say anything. And according to his thesis, by nature, and he sounds very philosophical when he says this, by nature, human beings are drawn towards injustice and domination, and it's only the weaklings of the world who make up the concept of justice. It's an artificial construct. It's a convention, a nomos in Greek. And they say that justice is good and injustice is bad, but that's just because they're resentful of those who are strong enough and superior. So his thesis is the superior should dominate, and that's the natural law. Problem with that, the first problem with that is Socrates says, who do you mean by superior? And it turns out he's not clear about who is superior. And this is something I think if we think about the relationship to Machiavelli, this is one of the many ways this dialogue helps us to see a problem with. You could see this in Machiavelli's Prince. Machiavelli says that it's the virtuous who follow virtue as he defines it, who have all the power and accumulate all the power in the world. But his whole book is directed at trying to undermine the power of Socrates and Christ because they have corrupted the world with their influence. So, this is part of the problem with Callicles and with Machiavelli, is they're saying on the one hand, the rule of nature is that whoever is stronger is better. But then on the other hand, the people who are actually dominant, they say are inferior, and it's not the way it should be, that these people shouldn't be in charge, somebody else should be in charge. And for Callicles, it's because he despises the majority, he despises the crowd, the hoi polloi. And Socrates says, but so all these weaklings who get together and force people to say that justice is good, they are the stronger because they're the ones who are forcing us to say that. So if they're stronger, according to your thesis, they are better and they're superior and they deserve to be able to do that to us. So he's contradicting himself, and he has to admit, okay, strength is not really what defines superiority. He then tries to go towards intelligence. Now, the problem here is that Socrates shows that intelligence leads to moderation, not immoderation. So, you could illustrate that with anything. If you understand how something works, then you know that a certain amount of a certain thing done at the right time in the right way is the way to do it. So if you know how to type, you're not just pounding the keyboard as hard as you can, right? You're hitting the right keys in the right order to be able to produce the results that you want. Anything is like that. If you know it, you're moderate, you're targeted, you're precise. If you're ignorant, then you're flailing around and doing random things. So the idea of more, I just want more, is intrinsically ignorant. It's a sign of ignorance. And so if you apply it to life in general, my life is about getting as much of whatever, fill in the blank, as much money, as much fame. That's a sign you don't know what your life is about. You don't know the meaning of life because you're completely imprecise and you're just trying to fill a void. You're just trying to cram things in without really knowing where it's going. So this becomes the real issue. Callicles is not able to rebut that as a matter of argument. He tries to turn back to this thing that Polus had also done, which is, well, look at the way of the world. That's not the way people are in the world, Socrates. People are trying to get more and more. One of the really crucial things that Socrates says, as we saw, is he says, well, you're right, Callicles. The majority of people, Callicles thinks he's above the majority of people. Socrates says, no, you're actually agreeing with the majority of people. Majority of people think getting more and more is better. That's because they're ignorant. That's because they don't actually know the meaning of life and they don't know what's going to make them happy. So the majority of people are ignorant and unhappy. Is that how you want to be? Do you want to join the crowd? Callicles thought he was above the crowd, but Socrates is showing that he and Gorgias and Polus, that's just a conceit on their part. They think they're superior to the crowd, but all they're really doing is putting lipstick on the pig. They're just repeating what the crowd believes in a fancier way. It sounds smarter, and they can pocket a lot of money for doing that, but they haven't actually thought through the limitations and the errors of what the crowd believes in, and they haven't come to a truer wisdom. So the final thing to recap here before we dive back in is that Socrates, Callicles is not willing to admit that Socrates is winning this argument. And one of Socrates' tactics to show him that it's not just abstract arguments, and I want to repeat that over and over because Socrates does make a lot of arguments that sound very abstract, and it seems like, and he's always accused, well, you're just making these arguments about mysterious, logical intricacies, and that just doesn't really seem to match the way the world is. But Socrates actually does repeatedly bring those abstractions back to reality, to the actual reality we live in. Because it turns out people who claim to be realists are actually not paying attention to reality. They're not paying attention to some of the most fundamental things. Sometimes things are so obvious we don't notice them. We just take them for granted. So what Socrates does is he says, okay, you're claiming, because part of Callicles' claim is that pleasure is the good, and getting the most pleasure possible is the best life. And Socrates just gives examples of people who devote their lives to pleasure. Think of any kind of an addict. He starts with somebody who's just scratching itches all day long. He gets into other more unpalatable examples. But think of anybody who's just addicted to pleasures and can't stop doing things just for the sake of pleasure. Is that how you want to live? Do you look at that person and say, oh, I admire this person. I want to be like this person. I think this person is superior. They're better than everybody else. No, we don't. Actually, quite the opposite. We tend to use derogatory terms for them. We tend to, despise them, basically. And we don't want to be like that. And if we're like that, well, we're not very happy about that. It's not making us happy to be that way. So this is real world examples that Socrates is showing your argument just is not realistic. It's not the way things actually work in the world. It's not what you actually admire. So we're going to pick up from there. And in this section, we're going to see that Socrates will really definitively defeat Callicles. I think he already has, but he's going to drive it home. and Callicles is not going to want to admit that he's defeated, but we are going to see some really significant evidence that Socrates has won the argument, and it will take us into our final episode on the Gorgias, where Socrates will be given a chance to give a summary of how he sees the world as opposed to the way that Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles have argued that the world is. So we're going to start here with, we're going to skip over some of the details as we usually do. One of the arguments that Socrates gets into is about being thirsty and hungry. And there's some technical aspects to this argument. But I think the basic point to see about the thirst and the hunger thing is that thirst is a kind of pain, for example. And when we finally drink and we relieve our thirst, there's a pleasure in that. But Socrates points out some oddities of this. For example, that you can't feel the pleasure of quenching thirst without the pain of thirst. And as soon as the pain goes away, the pleasure goes away. In other words, if you stop being thirsty and you keep drinking, it's not really pleasant anymore, and eventually become actually painful if you keep drinking, right? So it's like, if you're just think about drinking as for the sake of pleasure, it would be really strange. You can't have the pleasure of drinking without the pain of thirst, and when the pain goes away, the pleasure goes away too. But the solution for that is that the reason that a reasonable person, a rational person, drinks is not for the sake of pleasure. It might be pleasant when you drink at the right time and the right amount and so forth, and that's great. You can enjoy that, but you're not doing it for that sake. Thirst is a sign that your body is dehydrated and needs water, and when you drink, you are restoring the order of the body. You're restoring, the proportion of liquid in the body, and so you don't need it anymore. In other words, the purpose of drinking is not for pleasure, but for health. And, the pleasure and pain is just a stimulus that helps to alert us to what we need to do for our health. But if we get fixated on the pleasure, we would be completely missing the point, and we could actually end up hurting ourselves or just making silly mistakes, thinking I just need to drink as much as possible, for example, which eventually is going to be damaging. So anyway, with this example, he's just showing him one example after the other how maximizing pleasure does not actually make sense. And as Socrates is making this argument, he says, doesn't each of us stop being thirsty at the same time he stops feeling pleasure at drinking? And Callicles, of course, he can see the point that Socrates is making. He can see that his own thesis makes no sense, okay? And he's just not going to want to admit this. He's going to try a million different tricks to just to brush Socrates off. But look what happens. He says, I don't know what you mean. Of course, that's very insincere, right? The point was pretty clear. But Gorgias interjects, and this is really important because remember, the dialogue is titled Gorgias. Gorgias is a main character in the dialogue, even though he does a lot less talking than his students, especially Callicles. But remember, at the beginning of the dialogue, we saw that Gorgias what he likes to do is just give speeches. He didn't really want to get into a dialogue at all. He thought he could handle it, but after a very brief exchange with Socrates, he was trying to retreat. He was saying, we're gonna bore all these people here. I don't want to bore them. Let's not, get into this. Now they all, his students and the other people there, they all chime in and say, no, we do want to hear it. And they almost force him into having this conversation. But he doesn't do too well because, as Paulus said, he was ashamed to admit what he really thinks. And so he's had to have his students do the argument for him. At a couple points, we have seen him jump into the conversation a little bit, expressing a real interest in what's going on. And towards the end of the dialogue, when Callicles is becoming just extremely sarcastic with Socrates, and Callicles is basically trying to end the conversation, here's what Gorgias says. He says, none of that, Callicles. Just answer him. For our sakes too, so that the speeches, the arguments may be brought to an end. So what kind of an end is he looking for? Is he like he wants to get this over with? Let's see what he really wants. Callicles says, but Socrates always like this, Gorgias. He asks little questions of little importance and makes a refutation out of them. So, he's a sore loser, okay? He lost the argument clearly, but he's whining about it. True superior man, right? And Gorgias says, but what difference does that make to you? There's nothing here that's a matter of your honor, Callicles. Just submit to Socrates to refute you however he wants. So there's literally a submission to Socrates. And this is so ironic because, Socrates is the one who's supposedly out of touch with the world, and he doesn't understand how the world works, and he doesn't understand power, politics, and how to, get rich and succeed at life. And amidst all these people who are, superior in these things, he ends up being the one who dominates, to the point where Gorgias, the teacher, says, submit to him, okay? Just submit to him. And Callicles says, go on and ask these trivial questions of yours, since that's the way Gorgias likes it. Nobody is really going to admit that they are persuaded by Socrates. Polus, I think, comes the closest to admitting that. So we're not going to get a complete, sort of a complete satisfaction. Remember, Socrates had said that it's his argument with Callicles that will really prove whether he's right, if he can get, Callicles to admit that he's wrong, then Socrates can really succeed. And, in the Platonic corpus as a whole, Plato's dialogues, the most typical ending for a dialogue is what they call an aporia, which is a dead end, where they don't even have an answer to the question at all. This dialogue is different in that Socrates does actually conclude with a very positive vision, an outline of how he sees things that gives us a sort of answer to basic questions. But even here, there's always a certain degree of indeterminacy in any of the dialogues. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One thing is that Plato says in his seventh letter that wisdom is not something that can be transmitted by speech or writing. Wisdom is a virtue that we have to acquire for ourselves. So Plato in these dialogues is not simply trying to feed us wisdom, and so we're just going to become wise by passively ingesting this. He's trying to engage us in really what is a lifelong quest for wisdom. So it's never really over as long as we're on this earth. There's no perfect wisdom here, and that's always shown in the dialogues by, even when there's a relatively firm conclusion, it's not absolute. But Socrates is going to sort of finish things off with Callicles. And again, I think the really significant things to look at are the sort of real-world examples, because we want to see people so often misunderstand Plato and Socrates as being about these abstractions and these ideas floating in space. And I think it's really the opposite. Plato writes dialogues in which Socrates is interacting with real people, and he's interacting with them about their actual lives and what makes them happy or not. And so Socrates says, what about this? Do you call good men foolish and cowardly? You didn't just now at any rate, but we're saying that they're the manly and the smart ones. Or do you not call them good? So Socrates is now trying to get a bit clearer again about this question of who's superior, who's really good. Because Callicles had been trying to argue that maximizing pleasure is what's good, but he also admires those who are intelligent, he admires those who are courageous. And Socrates says, well, what is it? Are you saying that, courage and intelligence are actually bad? Or don't you think they're good? And he says, very much so. Of course they're good. Courage and intelligence are good. Well, haven't you ever seen a foolish child having pleasure? Socrates asks. I have. So pleasure and intelligence are not necessarily linked. How then could we define the superior man being intelligent and the superior man maximizing pleasure? You don't have to be intelligent to have pleasure. Socrates says, but you've never seen a foolish man having pleasure? Callicles, I've seen that. Okay, so whether young or old, you can be foolish and you can have pleasure. So you can't identify these things, that the good is having pleasure, the good is being intelligent. Which one is it? Right? They're not the same thing. What about a person with good sense being in pain or having pleasure? I'd say so. So there's no necessary connection. And which ones have more pleasure and more pain, the smart ones or the stupid ones? Callicles, I imagine there's not a lot of difference. Socrates goes through the same thing with courage. He said, do you think cowards have less pleasure in life? Sometimes they have more. Like when the other army retreats, they're actually enjoying that more than the courageous people. So you can't identify pleasure with intelligence, and you can't identify pleasure with courage, but he admires intelligence and he admires courage so it's not the pleasure of them, it's not the pleasure they bring that he admires. He has to admit people who are dumb and people who are cowardly can have just as much or even more pleasure than people who are smart or courageous. So if he admires smarts and courage, it's not because of the pleasure that they bring. And this is not an abstract argument. This is, who do you actually admire in real life, and what makes you admire them? The intelligence and the courage are not admirable because of pleasure they bring, because you don't have that experience that intelligence and courage are maximizing pleasure. That's not what we actually experience in life. So the logic comes in here when Socrates, is just showing him the contradictions in his opinions. But he thinks pleasure is great, and he thinks intelligence is great, and courage is great. So then a bad person turns out to be bad and good to a similar degree as a good person. That is, we're measuring, goodness by pleasure, but we're also saying that courage and intelligence are good. A good person could be even worse than a bad person, measured in this way. Makes no sense. Don't these things, as well as those previous ones, follow if anyone claims that pleasant things and good things are the same? Isn't that a necessity, Callicles? Callicles says, all the time I've been listening to you, Socrates, responding with agreement, I've been taking note of how, if anyone gives into it on any point, even as a joke, you hang onto it with glee, the way teenagers would, as if you could imagine that I or anyone else at all of humankind didn't consider some pleasures better and others worse. So this is an example of Callicles' extremely poor sportsmanship, because this is a completely disingenuous move that he makes here. We know that Callicles came in here promising that he would hold his ground and that he would argue that maximizing pleasure is the great good. He would have no shame. He would never back down on it. And now when he's forced to back down and admit that maximizing pleasure is not the good, what does he do? He flips it on Socrates and says, I was joking the whole time, and you were just taking advantage of me. You knew I was joking, but you pretended that you took it seriously. Say it was serious, right? We know it was as serious as possible. And so now he just pretends that it was all a joke. So this, in effect, is admitting defeat, because you see what he says at the end. Some pleasures are better and others are worse. That means that pleasure is not the measure of goodness. It is not the measure of superiority. We're measuring good pleasures versus bad pleasures. That means that the measure is something other than pleasure. And what's that going to be? Well, this is the whole point Socrates has been trying to make. The entire dialogue is that we don't actually measure the goodness of things by these subjective standards, not if we are thinking straight. So Socrates, of course, has to admonish him a bit for his disingenuousness. But when he gets back to the argument, he says, now, do you mean, say, those sorts of pleasures we were just talking about that apply to the body, those involved in eating and drinking, and that the ones that produce health in the body or strength or some other excellence of the body are good, but the ones that produce effects opposite to these are bad? So here again, we want to pay close attention to how Socrates is defining the good. Next time, we're going to look at his sort of holistic summary of how he understands these things. But throughout the dialogue, he has given us many hints and clues by the examples that he uses. And once again, he uses health in the body as an analogy for health in the soul. And the key point is that there's an objective order. What makes the body healthy is, for example, having the right amount of hydration, or having the right strength of the right parts, moving and operating in the right way. the organs functioning and so forth. There's an objective order, and the things that promote that order are good, and the things that disturb that order are bad. And it's not any pleasure or pain that defines that. So if it happens to be pleasant to put the body back in order, then that's great. But if we have to do something a little painful that's going to fix the body and put it back into order, then that painful thing will be good. And it will make sense to embrace that pain as a necessary step towards the good. So the same way with pains, some are worthwhile and some are worthless. So yes, pain could be a sign something is wrong, but pain could also sometimes go along with something that's beneficial. So what matters is not the pleasure in pain. What matters is that we pay attention to what is good. And with the body, this is very obvious. We all know this. And Callicles, of course, can't deny this. Of course, he says that's true about the body. So just to round it off, Socrates says, well, what would we do with this insight, right? How do we respond to this? Therefore, one ought to take on everything else, even pleasures for the sake of good things, and not good things for the sake of pleasures. This is a very key formula of Socratic ethics. It's not that pleasure is bad. Pleasure can be good. Pleasure can be bad. That's the point. Pleasure is neither good nor bad always. And therefore, pleasure is never the central focus of decision making. It's not the reason that we do anything. If we do things for the sake of pleasure, we will eventually go wrong because some pleasures are bad. So therefore, what we need to make decisions is based on what is good or bad, and then take the pleasure and pain as they come with the good things that we pursue. Overall, Aristotle says the good life is going to be more pleasant than a bad life. But in specific things we do, some good things may be painful at times. So we have to make the decisions based on goodness rather than pleasure. And Socrates says, and it is in every man's power to pick out from among pleasant things which sorts are good and which sorts are bad? Or is there a need for someone with an art for each case? So this gets to the next level of analysis, which is how do we know what's good or bad? We have to have knowledge of the order. So to know what's good for the body or bad for it, you have to understand the body. You have to understand how it works. And so with anything that you're doing, you have to understand how that thing works. Otherwise, you don't know what is beneficial or not. And so it takes a techne, an art, a practical knowledge of something to be able to make that decision. Then let's recall again precisely those things I happen to be saying to Paulus and Gorgias. Because if you remember, I was saying that there could be some arrangements that extend as far as pleasure and provide that very thing alone, ignorant of what's better and worse, while others discern that there's a good and a bad. So this is what he had said when he said that rhetoric is an art of persuasion based on pleasure and pain, what people like to hear, what is going to make them feel good. Whereas politics, he had said, is an art of persuasion or decision-making based on knowledge of what is actually good. So he's going back to his original critique of rhetoric, that without knowing what is good, we don't have the power to choose what is actually worthy of being chosen in any particular situation. And whatever persuasion we may use is going to be misleading not only others, but even ourselves. So how would you apply this to politics and to leadership? This course is about truth, justice, and leadership. This is a key passage where Socrates applies it to leadership of the city of Athens. Okay, what about the rhetoric directed to the Athenian populace or to the other populations of free men in the cities? What in the world do we make of that? Do rhetoricians seem to you to be speaking always with a view to what's best, aiming at that with their speeches so the citizens will be the best they can possibly be? Or do they too exert themselves towards gratifying the citizens and place a low value on the common good for the sake of their own private interest, talking to the populace like they were children, trying only to gratify them without giving any thought to whether they'll be better or worse from that? So there's two modes of politics here. One that he would describe as rhetorical in the Gorgian sense, you could say, and that is talking to the people, to the populace, as to little children who don't know what is true or not. And the speaker is not concerned about whether something is true or beneficial. He's only concerned about his own advantage in the moment. And by the way, Socrates has shown it's not his true advantage, because if my goal is just to have as much money or fame as possible, for example, or as much power as possible, I'm not actually thinking about what's good for myself any more than I'm thinking about what's good for the people that I'm fooling with my rhetoric. So one of the victims of rhetoric, in other words, is the rhetorician. But the alternative to that is an actual knowledgeable speech about what the choices we're making and what will be beneficial or not. And this would be true politics. And Callicles says, this is no longer a simple question you're asking, because there are some who say the things they say out of care for the citizens, and some who are the sort you're speaking of. So this is crucial in the sense that Callicles is admitting the distinction. He says, yeah, there actually are good, politicians. There are people who are seeking the good of the city. And clearly he's understanding that this is a real distinction, and it's an important distinction. That if you were getting into politics, which one would you want to be, for example? Well, Gorgias and his students have been preparing to be the rhetoricians who are just fooling people. But at this point in the dialogue, Callicles is starting to see, even though he doesn't want to admit it, that, well, actually, I would admire the politicians who are actually seeking the common good of society. So isn't that what you would really want to be? Or do you want to be somebody that you don't admire? So again, he's never going to officially admit that he's persuaded by Socrates, but you can see that it's really clicking with him, that he does think that there are politicians who are good, and he clearly admires that. And Socrates is helping him to see that if you were really serious about being happy in life, you would be studying those people and trying to be like those people, because that's something that you deep down you admire. So why wouldn't you want to emulate that? So Socrates, is pretty happy with what Callicles has admitted here. He says that's good enough, because if this is also twofold, one part of it would presumably be an ugly pandering, a flattery and a demagoguery, while the other would be a beautiful thing, turning its efforts to the way the souls of the citizens would be the best they can possibly be. This is one of the several places where Socrates says that politics is the art of caring for souls. And in this case, trying to make the souls of the citizens the best they can possibly be. And struggling to say the best things, whether they're more pleasing or more unpleasant to those who hear them. So this is one of the ways we could see how the health of the soul is like the health of the body. Overall, having a healthy soul is more pleasant, but sometimes for health of soul, we have to hear things, we have to say things and hear things that are not pleasant. We have to have criticism, correction when we are off track. But you've never seen this sort of rhetoric, or if you have any such rhetorician to mention, why haven't you told me who it is too? So earlier Socrates had said that the majority of people have this more Machiavellian kind of sense that just getting more is better. And here he says, as far as leadership, you haven't seen leaders who are true leaders, have you? He's implying that the actual leadership of Athens is corrupt. Right? And Callicles, he takes this as a very serious question. He says, by Zeus, I don't have a single one to mention to you, at least among the rhetoricians of today. So those that he admires are, as we find here, are from the past. He doesn't really see anybody around him who has these virtues of a leader directing people towards the common good. But Callicles does have his heroes, so to speak, the people that he thinks were good leaders. And there will be a point of disagreement here with Socrates on this. Socrates says, what about those of the old days? Do you have any to mention through whom the Athenians are held to have become better from the time he first started his public speaking and when they've been worse in the preceding time? because I don't know who that would be. So Socrates says, well, I agree with you. We don't have good leaders today. I don't see any from the past either. Socrates doesn't see any examples of good leaders in Athens, present or past. And Callicles says, what about Themistocles? Don't you hear that he was a good man? And also Simon and Miltiades and that very Pericles who died recently and whom you even heard speak? So these are people that, especially Themistocles and Pericles, are still renowned today. Pericles is still considered to be one of the great leaders of history for the way that he led Athens. And he just recently died. Socrates saw him speak, in person and everything. And so Callicles is aghast that Socrates doesn't admire Themistocles or Pericles. These are great leaders. They made, Athens great. So here we want to think about Machiavelli in the way he sees certain men as great because they made their peoples great. They build these empires. Something similar to the way Callicles thinks. But notice how Socrates responds to this. He says, yes, Callicles, if what you were saying virtue is true virtue, namely satisfying the desires of oneself and others. So in other words, if you accept the Machiavellian thesis, then yeah, it makes sense that the great leaders are the ones who maximize the satisfaction of desire. And that's the way that Socrates sees Themistocles and Pericles. Right? They helped the Athenians to satisfy their desires. They built an Athenian empire, basically. They made Athens strong and dominant in the world. But he says, if it's not that, if satisfying desires is not the key to happiness, but it's what we were compelled to agree it is later in our speech, fulfilling those desires whose satisfaction makes a human being better and not those that make him worse. And there's a certain art to this. I certainly couldn't say how any of these was that sort of man. So, in other words, Socrates says, I don't see how these leaders fostered moderation. I don't see how they fostered true happiness. They were, greedy. They encouraged the people to be greedy. This was not beneficial, for the people. They were corrupters of the people. They looked good through a Machiavellian lens. Now, notice here, there's a direct rebuttal. This, of course, is many, many centuries before Machiavelli, but there's a direct rebuttal of Machiavelli's theory that is natural and ordinary to desire to acquire, and the only criterion is success or failure. Socrates says that virtue is fulfilling those desires whose satisfaction makes a human being better. So, in a certain sense, very similar to Machiavelli's definition of virtue, acquiring what we desire. But for Socrates, it's acquiring those things that make us better, acquiring what is good for us. That's what virtue is. If we desire something and it's good for us and we get it, that's virtuous. But desiring and acquiring things that are bad for us is not virtue because it's bad for us. So Socrates is going to bring this around now to a general formula of what the health of the soul is. And next time we're going to see in much more detail how he spells that out. But as he brings this to a head, we have already seen a lot of examples that should help us to at least begin to piece this together. Because it's one thing to say that Gorgias and Paulus and Callicles are wrong to desire money and fame and power, that it's what they want is incoherent. They can't even define it clearly. They contradict themselves over and over again when they try to explain it. So clearly it does not make sense. But then there's still the question, what else is there? What would Socrates substitute instead of just getting more? And, he said things that make us better. It's the health of the soul, health of body, but most of all the health of the soul that matters. But what is health of the soul? What does that mean? As long as that's just an expression that he's throwing around, then it's not really answering the question of what alternative is there to the Machiavellian kind of virtue. And so he formulates it here. He says, and for the arrangements and orderings of the soul, as opposed to the body, in the body these arrangements are health, But in the soul, it's law-abiding and law, from which souls become law-abiding and orderly. And these conditions are justice and moderation. Do you say so or not? And Callicles says, let it be so. So it's not an enthusiastic affirmation. At this point, he's just nodding and smiling. He's just going along with Socrates because, I mean, Socrates has shown that he's wrong, but he doesn't want to admit it. So his heart is not in this discussion. So again, we're going to unpack this next time, but just to see initially, like, what sense does this make? It's just like with the body, there's an order of things, an order of the organs and the systems and the parts of the body. In the soul, there's an order. And part of what that order means is that, things have a purpose, they have a certain nature, they work under certain conditions, they fulfill certain functions. And these are the measures of health or not. So if my lungs are, expanding, contracting, and they're pulling in oxygen, and they're allowing my blood to pick up the oxygen, and whatever else the lungs, do, if they're doing those things, then the lungs are healthy. To the extent that it's impeded and it's not doing that to the max, then they're unhealthy. Okay, so everything can be measured in that way. So what is meant by the law-abidingness or the orderliness of the soul? And what does it have to do with justice and moderation? Well, we have seen already that one of the little clues Socrates has when he said that a doctor cures the body with the soul. So when the doctor knows the order of the body, right, he knows what's good for the body, and he prescribes what is good for the body. Here's a medicine, here's a surgery, here's an exercise that's going to be good for the body. That knowledge of it's beneficial to the body, but the knowledge exists in the soul. So this gives us a clue to what the soul is and how the soul works and what the order of the soul is. The soul is capable of knowing the order of the body. That means that one of the functions of the soul is knowledge. And that means in the order of the soul is healthy when it knows things, and the soul is unhealthy when it's ignorant of things. So sometimes we think of knowledge as just having an external practical value. So if I know how to fix something, the benefit of that is the thing gets fixed, and now the thing works. Okay, and that's true. If we know how the body works, we can potentially fix it. If we know how the car engine works, we could fix it. But there's also, if we turn around and look and say, okay, what about the soul? The soul that knows something, whether or not that knowledge fixes something else. Let's say you're a doctor, and you've done such a good job curing people that nobody's sick anymore, everybody's healthy. Now, it may be bad for your wallet because nobody's going to come and pay you anymore, but it's good for the bodies. Like, you cured all the bodies, they're in good shape. But you still know how the body works. That knowledge is still true, and that is not just something that you could make money with if people come in, or not something that you could use to help people if people need your help, but it's also something that shows that your soul is in good shape. If your soul was in bad shape, you couldn't know that. You couldn't know things. So knowledge is a sign of a healthy soul. And that means that there's an intrinsic value to knowing things. We don't know things just to accomplish other things, even though we often can. But we actually desire to know just for the sake of knowing, because that's the order of the soul. The soul exists partly to know things. And just like the lungs are for breathing, the mind is for knowing. And when our mind knows things, it's healthy, it's strong. That's a sign of the good order. And on the other hand, when we're ignorant, it's a sign of disorder of the mind. So I like to use the example of, let's say that I was trying to brush my teeth with this pencil. Okay. Now, obviously, as far as my teeth go, it's not going to be beneficial. I'm going to get cavities and stuff. It's not going to fix my teeth. That's a problem. But if you saw me trying to brush my teeth with this pencil, you wouldn't think the worst thing is my teeth are going to be in trouble, which they will. The worst thing would be, what about my mind? What's wrong with my mind? Right? I don't understand what a pencil is. I don't understand how it works. I don't understand what it's for. I don't understand what my teeth need. They need a toothbrush, not a pencil. So the worst problem for me would be my mind. My mind would be disordered. And so even the simplest things that are not necessarily important in themselves, if they're a sign of mental disorder, that would disturb us. We would think there's a problem. We would be concerned about that. So Callicles is not very enthusiastic here, but Socrates is making an extremely vital point. There's an order to the soul, and it's characterized by justice and moderation for reasons that we'll look at in more depth next time. But this would be an example. Knowledge, as he had said before, goes along with moderation because a knowledgeable person knows the right amount of the right thing at the right time is beneficial and is not trying to cram as much as possible into a particular thing. So Socrates says then that rhetorician, the one who's artful and good, if he gives us any gift or takes anything from us, he'll give it or take it, having his thoughts on this, on how justice may be brought into the souls of his fellow citizens and injustice may be eliminated, on how moderation may be brought in and self-indulgence eliminated, and how the rest of virtue may be brought in and vice expelled. Do you go along with that or not? And Callicles, I go along with it. He's going along with it reluctantly, but we can see already that Socrates is preparing to really illustrate what the alternative is to this kind of ignorant grasping for things that are not really going to satisfy us. And he's making it clear that there is something better, which is justice and moderation that actually bring health to the soul. And this is good for individuals, but is also, therefore, the goal of true leadership is to help others to see that and to achieve that. Going a little bit more into sort of the art of it and the implications for this, again, for the leadership. So fulfilling one's desires, such as eating or drinking as much as one wants when hungry or thirsty, is something the doctors allow for the most part when someone is healthy. But when he's sick, they allow him to fill up on things. When he's sick, they allow him to fill up on things he desires, in a word, never. Do you go along with that or not? So he's pointing out here that when we're in a state of health, our desires tend to be healthy. They tend to, help us to maintain health. But when we're out of order, then our desires can also be out of order. And so, again, the choices should be made based on a knowledge of what's beneficial. The feelings, the passions can be misleading. But the passions are more likely to be healthy in somebody with a healthy body. And Callicles agrees. And Socrates says, concerning the soul, most excellent fellow, isn't it the same way? I would say even more so, because remember, we cure the body with the soul. So it's the soul that needs to understand what the order of things is and what's beneficial. So if the soul is out of order, we're going to have a distorted sense of what is beneficial. That's almost intrinsic to the idea of having a disordered soul, is that it's a soul that misunderstands things. As long as it's in a worthless condition, the soul, and is thoughtless and self-indulgent and unjust and impious, one needs to keep it back from its desires and not trust it to do any other things than those as a result of which it will be better. Do you assert this or not? Callicles asserts it. Again, rounding this off, is we shouldn't be making decisions based just on desires. But one of the problems that occurs is that if the soul is disordered, then it's making misjudgments, which is going to lead to further disorder. So we have to somehow break out of that cycle, and this is one of the reasons that leadership is so important, because somebody needs to intervene. Basically, somebody needs to take the individual aside, or if it's the people as a whole, somebody needs to speak to the people as a whole and say, wake up, you're going in the wrong direction here. Your soul is disordered. You need to rethink what you're doing. So this is a conclusion that shows us something important about Socratic leadership. Therefore, being disciplined is better for the soul than a lack of discipline, which you imagine was better a little while ago. Of course, people don't like discipline. So it's typical of the sort of immature mentality of saying, I don't want to be disciplined. But if we understand that there's an objective good and that we might be going astray from it and somebody may be setting us straight, then we would have to admit that it's at least possible that being corrected or disciplined would be beneficial for us. Callicles, he doesn't want to admit this. This is just too much for him to swallow. I don't know what you're talking about, Socrates. Just ask someone else. Once again, Gorgias comes in. This, again, I think is really important to look at. Socrates never quite gets Callicles to admit that he's wrong and Socrates is right. But Gorgias, towards the end, just intervenes multiple times to disallow Callicles from, completely throwing a wrench into this argument. In fact, what happens here is that, as we'll see next episode, because Callicles is just unwilling to continue with this discussion, Socrates is just going to have to make a speech. Another irony, he prefers conversation to making big speeches, but at the end, he's just going to have to make a big speech because nobody will argue with him anymore. But it's Gorgias who insists, I want to hear Socrates give a speech. The whole dialogue started where Socrates didn't really care about hearing Gorgias give a speech. But Gorgias didn't really want to have a conversation with Socrates either. And it ends with Gorgias wants Socrates to make a speech. And Gorgias says, but it doesn't seem right to me to go away yet, Socrates. So he's arguing on the basis of justice as well, right? But instead, for you to go on through the speech, and it appears to me to seem that way to the others as well. So the whole crowd is on Gorgias' side here, that they want to hear Socrates give this speech, and it would be wrong, it would be unjust not to hear Socrates at this point. So they're all motivated by justice, and they want to hear this account of justice. They want to hear how Socrates is going to show the goodness of justice when they were pretty much all assuming before that justice was for ninnies, basically. They didn't care about it at all. I myself, he says, certainly want to hear you go through the things that are left yourself. So there's a very clear, again, Gorgias is never going to come out and say, you persuaded me, Socrates, I'm going to change my life or something like that. But there is a very clear vote of confidence in Socrates towards the end of the dialogue of saying what you are arguing needs to be heard, and we need to hear it. We definitely want to hear it, even if Callicles is too humiliated by his defeat and he doesn't want to admit that it's worth hearing. Everybody else in the room is very enthusiastic about hearing Socrates. So next time, we will hear how Socrates wraps up this conversation with a little speech on the nature of things as he sees it.